Hello, class, and welcome to week 5 in the class. This week we're going to be talking about how to identify underrepresented gifted students. We're going to be talking about who those students are and how to identify them in greater numbers. So today our topics break down into 4 areas. Who are underrepresented students? How do you determine whether students are underrepresented in your school's gifted program? Why are some gifted students underserved, and what can we do about it? So first of all, who are underrepresented gifted students? What do we mean by that term? It breaks down into 4 groups. Culturally and linguistically diverse students, you might hear me call those CLD learners. English language learners or ELL students. Economically disadvantaged students, and 2E students. We're going to avoid the use of the word minority. That's a commonly used word, but it's a little inaccurate. There are minorities that are overrepresented in gifted programs, for example, Asian populations. So we want to be very specific about which group we're referring to. First, let's talk about CLD learners, or culturally and linguistically diverse learners. These are students who grow up in households that differ in some way from the system norm white, middle to upper class North American household. So that might be students, for example, who are from a cultural heritage that is African, Hispanic, Asian, American, Indian, Middle Eastern, Russian, Alaskan Native, and more. As probably many of you understand, this demographic is increasing in the United States. Currently, while 80% of public school teachers are white, fewer than 50% of students are white. So that's what we mean by CLD learners. And these students traditionally are underrepresented in gifted programs, even though they might be very bright. English language learners are students whose lack of English proficiency could affect their performance. So they might be very proficient in their own language, but they've come here, they haven't quite mastered the English language, and they might underperform. We also know that the population of ELL students in the United States is growing and growing rather rapidly. Part of the problem is that students learn language skills in 2 different ways. There's social language skills. These are the skills they need to communicate with their friends, with you, and they may be more advanced than academic language skills, or the skills they need to write a paper, for example. So it typically takes 4 to 6 years to learn academic language skills versus only 1 to 3 years for social. So you might hear them talking in your classroom and go, well, they're fluent in English, but they're not showing that in their papers because they haven't mastered that level of English yet. Consequently, these students may perform more poorly on English assignments and tests, even if they understand the content. So you can see how this would get in the way of identification. A third category of underrepresented students consists of the economically disadvantaged learners, children in poverty. 20.7% approximately of children today in the United States live in poverty. That's 1 out of 5 children living below the poverty line. Typically, Black and Hispanic children experience the highest rates of poverty. And so why is that problematic for identification? Well, economically disadvantaged students may lack basic necessities and may experience an unstable home environment, which can result in chronic stress and underperformance. So if you're going home and there's not enough food to eat, or both parents are out working 2 jobs and you're alone all the time with no one to help or check on homework, if you're stressed like that, it can definitely lead to underperformance. These students may also lack what we call cultural capital, or the ability to draw on the knowledge of their parents and grandparents. For example, we see this a lot as well in first-generation college students, where their parents may not have been to college, so they don't know how to apply for financial aid or to ask the kinds of questions about what classes they need to be taking. These kids are kind of on their own, so they lack that cultural capital. Our fourth category of underrepresented students consists of 2E learners. These are gifted students with one or more special needs. So they might be gifted and dyslexic. They might be gifted and emotionally handicapped. They might have another identifiable need, learning need. And I like to think about it's like a fast car with a broken engine. The second disorder is hiding their ability to perform. You imagine having this magnificent Porsche in the garage that's capable of going 120 miles an hour on the highway, but its engine, there's something, a kink in the engine, it can't go that fast. But if you could deal with that somehow, it could go that fast. We're going to spend a whole week talking about 2E learners, so I'm not going to dwell on this right now. But those are the categories of underrepresented gifted students. How do you go about determining if your school's gifted program has an underrepresentation problem? Well, first you must look at the percentage of the entire school population made up by the target group and compare it to the percentage of that target group in the school's gifted program. For example, if CLD students make up 35% of the school's total population, but there are no CLD students in the gifted program, there is an identification problem, and we'll get into the reasons why. Sometimes that ratio can't be reached. Dr. Donna Ford, a prominent researcher, and you'll read one of her articles this week, or I'm sorry, you'll view a video of her this week, suggests a minimum of 20% less than the school's makeup. So, for example, in the example above, the school would aim for a minimum of 15% of CLD students. If there are 35% in the school's population, subtract 20% and you get 15%. But regardless, there should be some CLD students in the gifted program. We know that giftedness occurs in every population and every culture. So there should be representation there. And if there's not, it's a problem with the way students are being identified. Many gifted programs fall far short of this goal. So let's get into why are some gifted students underidentified or underserved. So if we think about what we all think about giftedness looking like, typically we think about students who are a certain way. And you might be thinking, for example, a student that's very highly organized and very motivated. But gifted may look different in different populations, and especially in underserved populations, than it does in traditionally served student populations. This might be for a number of reasons. It could be, for example, what the culture teaches. So, for example, in some cultures, children are taught to look down rather than looking an adult in the eye. And so teachers may see a student who looks down as being uninterested, whereas this might be just what the culture teaches. So there are lots of factors about why giftedness could look different. If economically disadvantaged students, for example, are struggling or hungry at home, they might not be able to perform at capacity, and teachers may not realize that. Couple that fact with the fact that all educators have implicit biases that affect their abilities to see all students closely. And we'll talk about implicit biases and what they are a little bit more. But basically, they're our understandings about people, and when we may not even be conscious of what our biases are. Gifted learners from underserved groups face unique challenges in formal gifted assessment and identification, and this is due to the nature of how we traditionally identify gifted students in this country. Let's take a look at how giftedness may look different. Teachers typically look for knowing and sharing all answers, as well as good organizational skills and behavior in gifted students. I've even had teachers talk to me about how all gifted students should have good handwriting. These are myths about what typical gifted students are, as we've seen from some of our fun little quizzes at the beginning of the course. Many gifted individuals who grew up to make significant contributions. Albert Einstein, for example, comes to mind, didn't have those qualities, but there's still this myth or perception that the gifted student is and acts this way. Many underrepresented students may not exhibit these behaviors, as we've discussed in this lecture, but still may possess advanced abilities. However, many initial screening checklists, and you've probably seen these in our earlier work in the course, focus on those typical behaviors, or sometimes on experiences that students aren't given opportunities to do. For example, a checklist might contain an item like, does your child like to go to museums? A parent nomination form. Well, if you don't have the money to go to museums, you can't check yes on that. Maybe your child's never been to a museum. Because of these barriers, teachers and parents fail to nominate their own students, their own children, for gifted programs. Sometimes, and a lot of times, it's because they don't recognize what makes that child truly gifted. This is one reason why changing these instruments, specifically these screening instruments, and using a universal screening approach in addition to parent and teacher nomination is important. So we talked about universal screening as part of stage 1 in gifted identification earlier in the course, reviewing all of the scores, for example, on a standardized test in the school, and taking the top 10% or whatever percent for further analysis. This way, a child is less likely to slip through a crack than if you just rely on teacher or parent nomination. Let's talk about the role of implicit bias. If we're going to rely on teachers and parents to nominate students, they have to see that student is having above average abilities. But implicit bias that we all have may get in the way of that. Implicit biases are unconsciously held attitudes that people may not realize exist in their minds or manifest through their actions. So I might look out at my students and I might have a couple of children in my room from a particular cultural group that I have an implicit bias towards, and I might say they can't possibly be gifted. Now, you might doubt that you have these or your friends have these. You might think you are very open to other cultures and races, but what the research suggests is we all have these implicit biases, and we need to study what they are in ourselves and deal with them. You're going to watch a video this week from a recent Yale study in which preschool teachers were called in and asked to watch students and watch students for instances of misbehavior. So I'm not going to give away the ending of what that revealed, but it is pretty eye-opening about what they found in these preschool teachers and their implicit biases. If we all have implicit bias, how can we avoid letting that spill over onto our students? So some strategies that I would suggest are listed here. Avoiding stereotypes. So for example, do you always ask, when you're doing your class assignments, do you always ask the boys to take out the trash? Do you always ask the girls to be the teacher's helper? Maintain high expectations for all students. Promote integration in your classroom. Encourage collaboration, seating across groups, etc. Treat students equally. Call on students equally. We know, for example, that boys tend to get called on more than girls. Do you have a system in your classroom for equal calling? Be concerned for students' welfare inside and outside of school. Are they exhibiting evidence of poverty, for example? Is there a way you can help? And respecting students' differences. Let's talk about a few identification issues and what we can do about those. So underrepresented students may have traits and abilities in areas not assessed by commonly used instruments. So for example, most instruments or assessments tend to focus on IQ or academic achievement. Those are the two well-known things that are assessed, constructs that are assessed when we identify gifted students. But there are many other types of giftedness and traits that we could look for that would help uncover underrepresented students. For example, leadership. This week you're going to read a case study about Anissa, who exhibited leadership. Creativity might be another one, and there are many others. What if we could find instruments or use instruments designed to screen for those traits? Then we might uncover more underrepresented students. It helps to select and use certain types of instruments that aid in uncovering these traits and abilities. This week you're going to learn about your next assignment, which is the Scripps screening. That stands for the Scales for Rating Behavioral Characteristics of Superior Students. And that's a checklist that is able to identify more underrepresented students. Nonverbal tests. Instead of using verbal IQ tests, for example, there are some very good and reliable nonverbal tests that we'll talk about. So the way you identify gifted students is very important in the outcome. You can make certain adjustments and identify far more underrepresented students. Recall that the traditional criteria for traditional identification are teacher nomination, IQ and aptitude tests, and achievement tests and grades. These are the three traditional areas for identification. Far less likely to identify underrepresented students than other ways. The frequent results are you miss underrepresented students, and sometimes there's a mismatch between talents and programs. So if you only use an IQ test and then you identify high IQ students, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have advanced abilities in math if your program is focusing on math. That's the golden rule we repeatedly talk about. So what can we do differently? Well, we can use some more non-traditional instruments and practices. So if you look on the left side of this, there are the traditional teacher recommendations and narrow checklists that just focus on achievement and aptitude. Non-traditional might be broader checklists and recommendations by more people. Certainly, we're going to include the teacher and the parents, but some districts go as far as allowing peers to nominate for programs because the students generally tend to know who the gifted students are. Or even community leaders, such as a Girl Scout leader, might have a student and she might say, wow, she's been really good. She earned the highest badge. She's always motivated. Traditional tests used in traditional identification have included, as I've said, IQ tests, achievement tests, and aptitude tests. Non-traditional tests include nonverbal ability tests and other types of instruments, such as creativity instruments. In traditional identification, you might have the inclusion of grades. In non-traditional identification, you might have the inclusion of student portfolios and performance tests. We're going to spend a whole week talking about non-tests, so we'll save that discussion for later. Finally, in traditional identification, you might say there's a fixed score cutoff, so all students have to score 130 and above on an IQ test. But in non-traditional identification, we have the use of what's called local norms, which I'll explain in a minute. So if we look at a better checklist or screening scale for initial steps in identification, we find the Scripps. The Scripps is an instrument developed by the University of Connecticut, researchers at the University of Connecticut. It stands for the Scales for Rating the Behavioral Characteristics of Superior Students. And it allows teachers or parents or peers to nominate students for a gifted program based on their attributes in all of these areas: learning, creativity, motivation, leadership, artistic ability, musical, science, dramatics, communication, planning, math, reading, and technology. Note the inclusion of many different types of scales other than what you might just traditionally find in a school: reading, math, science, social studies. Nonverbal tests are also very good at identifying underrepresented students. You're going to read about them in the reading this week. One I want to specifically point out is called the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, or the NNAT. And that's a sort of IQ test, but it utilizes shapes and figures to evaluate problem solving and nonverbal reasoning abilities of a child without relying on their language skills. You can see how this would be particularly effective at identifying students, ELL students, and maybe CLD students for gifted programs. It's good for ages 5 to 17, and it has 4 parts: pattern completion, reasoning by analogy, serial reasoning, and spatial visualization. It's considered culturally neutral. So unlike some of the other tests, it doesn't have items that reference cultural norms that these students wouldn't be familiar with. It does not require reading, and it incorporates abstract shapes and designs. So many programs that want to identify underrepresented students have begun to use or incorporate the NNAT instead of the traditional WISC IQ test. Another good practice at identifying underrepresented students is the use of local norms. And what that basically means is that you screen for and select students who are high performing within your school or district. So instead of using national norms, which are provided by the test makers, like if you do the IQ test and you use a WISC for that, they'll say, okay, 3% of students naturally scored above 130, and you might choose to use that as your cutoff. Local norms focus on how did our students in our local school or our local district perform, and can we take the top students of those students and put them in a gifted program. For example, selecting students who score in the top 5% of students within that school, that would be using building level, that's what we mean by building, it's the school, or the top 10% of race or ethnicity. So this has been very effective, and it's fair if you think about it. I taught in a school district in Florida where half the county was very affluent, and those students went skiing, for example, over spring break in Europe. They traveled extensively. They had many advantages, and then half the county consisted of economically disadvantaged students, usually the children of migrant farm workers. So you can see how local norms for the students who are economically advantaged would be of great advantage to uncovering underrepresented students, because those students couldn't possibly have had the same experiences as the more affluent community. It should be a building level set of local norms if there's a varying set of diversity and district demographics, as I just described. Half the community was affluent, half was not affluent, was poor. And so you don't want to compare those students, you want to compare within each school. Research shows that the use of local norms can increase the selection of underrepresented students by 300% or more, depending on how it's done. So what are some key ideas we've learned in this lecture? Traditional identification may miss underrepresented students for a variety of reasons. Strategies for non-traditional representation include using broader rating scales and checklists, nonverbal instruments, creativity tests, non-tests, which we'll talk about soon, and local norms. Thanks, everybody.